Hello and welcome to the Audit Room. This is part 2 of the series on developing the audit universe. In part 1, we discussed how to identify auditable entities in an organization and how to document them on a spreadsheet. You can find the link of part 1 in the description. If you have not already watched part 1, we suggest that you watch that before proceeding with this video. But before we get started, let's look at some key terms and definitions that we will be coming across throughout this video. Let's start with the definition of risk. Risk refers to the possibility of harm or loss occurring as a result of an action, event, or situation. It is a measure of the likelihood and severity of a negative outcome, and is often expressed as the product of the likelihood and consequence of an event. The process of identifying and evaluating risks in order to manage them effectively is called risk assessment. In a risk assessment, you will come across the term inherent risk. Inherent risk is the level of risk that already exists in a process or system without considering any control measures to manage or mitigate the risk. Inherent risk is an important consideration in risk assessment, as it provides a baseline against which the effectiveness of control can be evaluated. When we talk about control effectiveness in a risk assessment, it refers to the ability of control measures to reduce or mitigate the level of risk associated with a particular activity. Control measures can include policies, procedures, equipment, training, or any other actions that are taken to reduce the likelihood or impact of a risk. Once the control measures are in place, then we move to residual risk, which is the level of risk that still remains after all control measures have been implemented to mitigate or manage a particular risk. Residual risk is typically lower than inherent risk, but it can still represent a significant potential for harm or loss. Let us now look at the 3 common approaches to carrying out risk assessment. The first one is specific risk approach. This approach to risk assessment involves the identification and assessment of risks associated with specific auditable units. This approach focuses on analyzing and evaluating risks that are unique to a particular circumstance or scenario, and then developing strategies to mitigate or manage those risks. Then comes the risk-by-process approach. This approach is similar to the specific risk approach, however, this involves analyzing and assessing risks associated with specific processes or activities within an organization. The third approach is the risk factor approach. This approach to risk assessment involves analyzing and assessing risks based on risk factors that are present across the organization and provides a macro-level view. In today's video, we will be discussing how to conduct a risk assessment based on the specific risk approach. You can use the same methodology for conducting a risk assessment based on risk-by-process approach. We will cover risk assessments using the risk factor approach in the next video. So let's go over the steps on how to conduct a risk assessment using the specific risk approach. The first step in the process is to identify the risk types against which the risk assessment will be carried out. The risk types will largely depend on the organization's size, industry, and many other factors. Here are some risk types that may be common in many organizations. Strategic risk. These are the risks associated with the organization's strategic decisions and typically arise from the uncertainty of external factors. These can include changes in market conditions, competition, changes in consumer behavior, or the regulatory environment, as well as geopolitical instability. It can also include strategic decisions such as entering new markets, introducing new products, or making major investments. Financial risk. This type of risk involves the possibility of financial loss due to changes in market conditions, economic factors, or other financial variables like currency fluctuations, changes in interest rates, or changes in commodity prices and credit risk. Operational risk. This is the risk of loss due to failures in an organization's processes, systems, or people. These are the risks associated with the day-to-day operations of the organization, such as equipment failures, supply chain disruptions, system failures, fraud, or errors in processes. Reputational risk is the potential for damage to an organization's brand, image, or reputation. This can happen because of negative publicity, customer complaints, social media backlash, scandals. Legal and compliance risk. These are the risks associated with non-compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. Legal risks may arise from potential lawsuits, disputes, or regulatory action against an organization. These can include issues such as product liability, intellectual property infringement, or breach of contract. Other types of risks that you may consider include environmental risk, compliance risk, social risk, health and safety risk, and security risk. Once you have identified the risk types, the next step involves defining the criteria to be used for measuring the impact and likelihood for assessing these risks. Typically, organizations score the impact and likelihood on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. So let us first discuss how to establish the criteria for measuring impact related to each risk type. To begin this exercise, create a spreadsheet as shown here. List down the scores in the first column starting from highest to lowest and the attribute of that score in the next column. So let's say 5 is catastrophic, which means that if the risk transpires, the impact on the organization may be catastrophic. 4 is high. 3 is medium impact. 2 is low impact. 1 is insignificant, which means that if the risk occurs, the impact on the organization will be negligible or very minimal. Next, map each of the risk types that you had identified in step 1 in the columns towards the right. Once this is done, start defining the criteria for each score. These can be thresholds, amounts, values, time, and events. These can be set individually or in combination with each other. An example of the criteria for each risk type against the relevant score is given here. However, keep in mind that these criteria will be different for every organization and will largely depend on the organization's size, industry, and other factors. The next step in the process is to define the likelihood criteria for the risk assessment. Likelihood refers to the probability or chance of a specific event or outcome occurring, based on available information or data. To begin this exercise, create a spreadsheet as shown here. List down the likelihood scores in the first column starting from highest to lowest and the attribute of that score in the next column. In the next column, define the criteria by setting out frequency for each score. It is good practice to also define the probability for each score, which may be useful when assessing such risks where the frequency is not very relevant. An example of the likelihood criteria is shown here. However, keep in mind that the criteria may vary from one organization to another and will largely depend on the organization's size and industry amongst other factors. Now that we have established the risk types and defined the impact and likelihood criteria, we can proceed to assessing the risk against each auditable entity that we had identified in part 1 of this series. Here is how to carry out the risk assessment with a practical example. Start by writing down the risk types in the columns next to the auditable entities as shown here. Then for each risk type, create 3 sub-columns for likelihood, impact, and total. Total is the product of impact and likelihood. Once ready, start entering the likelihood and impact score based on the criteria you established in earlier steps. Put a formula to calculate the total for each risk, which is likelihood score multiplied by impact score. Once completed, add up the total of each score to arrive at the total risk score for the auditable unit. Next step is to create the risk ranking matrix. This matrix will be used to identify the level of risk for each risk score. Here is an example of how to set the thresholds to determine the risk ranking. Remember that setting the thresholds is judgmental and will vary from one organization to another. Once the risk ranking matrix is in place, use it to determine the inherent risk in each of the auditable unit. Once the inherent risk has been determined, The next step is to identify the control effectiveness within the auditable entity. This is important to determine the residual risk in the auditable entity. Control effectiveness in a risk assessment refers to the ability of control measures to reduce or mitigate the level of risk associated with a particular activity. Control measures can include policies, procedures, equipment, training, or any other actions that are taken to reduce the likelihood or impact of a risk. To carry out this exercise, define the assessment criteria to determine the effectiveness of controls in a process or an auditable unit. Here is an example of the control effectiveness criteria. The stronger the controls, the higher the ranking for control effectiveness. Next step is to develop the risk and control matrix to determine the residual risk. Here is an example of a risk and control matrix. Plot the inherent risk ranking into columns and the control effectiveness ranking in the rows as shown here. Then map the inherent risk to each control effectiveness ranking to determine the residual risk ranking. Again, this may vary from one organization to another. Once you have developed the risk and control matrix, return back to the risk assessment. Make an assessment of the control effectiveness against each auditable unit or process and plot the control effectiveness ranking as shown here. Then, by using the control and risk matrix, determine the residual risk. The residual risk will be used at a later stage when developing the risk-based internal audit plan. This is the end of part 2 of the series on how to develop an internal audit universe. Stay tuned for the next part. We will discuss how to conduct a risk assessment using the risk factor approach. If you found this video useful, please do hit the like button. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more informative videos like this.